Good evening. Great to see you at the beautiful History of Colorado that has been hosting the Map Month. Map Month this year is about persuasive maps. So also great to see everybody in Zoom land. And so tonight is the last of the four lectures on persuasive map, and it's a really good one. Without revealing the name of the speaker, because it's going to be introduced in a moment, he's one of my favorite map researchers. This gentleman has the ability to look at the most obscure, the most unresearched areas of topics of maps, but when he brings it to life, it just becomes a fascinating topic. And you will see that this is one of those. So this is going to be the last talk of the month. Then we're going to take a break during the summer, and we'll be back with more Rocky Mountain Map Society lectures in the fall. So to introduce our speaker and also tell us a little bit about other things, we have our own Wes Brown.
I have a library in my hand. Chet Van Duzer, official books. There we go. You are going to really enjoy this program. I got to know Chet at the Library of Congress when we were researching together. This man has an undergraduate degree from Berkeley in mathematics and English literature. Now think about that, mathematics and English literature. Tells you about this guy. He has wandered off all over the world as a map researcher, getting fellowships at the most prestigious institutions, where he'll go to the Library of Congress for 6 months and research and then write a book about it or something. He has written 4 books. He's written many other books on other subjects, but I'm going to only mention the 4 that have to do with maps. Henricus Marteus's World Map, which is at Yale, and we had a presentation on that for our society some years ago. Martin Waldseemüller's Carta Marina, and I have that book here. You're going to want to race out and buy it, and we'll have it in the back for you to look at. Frames that speak. Cartouches on, oops, here's microphones. Cartouches on early modern maps, and his greatest hit, his newest book, Sea Monsters. Sea Monsters. Sea Monsters has been 6,000 of these have been published so far and going up. It's been translated into 5 other languages. Sea Monsters on medieval and Renaissance maps, and it's a hit. So you never know what's going to just turn people on. Chet knows how to do that, and hopefully he will do that for us tonight. So please help me in welcoming Chet Van Duzer.
Great. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Wes kindly mentioned my book about cartouches. Most of the material you'll see today does not appear in that book, but I'll say a few more words about the book at the end. But that project was supported by a couple of significant fellowships, one at the Huntington Library. So what you'll see today in part derives from some work I did at the Huntington. So today I'll be talking about a particular type of cartouches, which is those that show especially colonialist imagery. But I'll begin with a general introduction to cartouches. In contemplating writing a book about cartouches, I realized that there's a problem in terms of marketing, which is that most people don't know what a cartouche is. And it was partly to combat that issue that I obtained 2 grants, as I'll say later, to make the book open access. So if you have the slightest curiosity about cartouches, it's just 1 click and you get the whole book, and you can explore to your heart's content. So we'll begin with a nice splashy image of a cartouche on the left by Matthias Suter, a German cartographer, one of my favorite cartouche artists. And a number of scholars have emphasized the importance of cartouches So J.B. Harley writes, "The cartouche is the pictura loquens, the speaking picture of cartography. Like the emblematic title page or frontispiece, it serves to abstract and epitomize some of the meaning of the work as a whole." And Stephanie Pratt has written, "Far from being marginal, the cartouche constitutes the map." I would say that it is in their cartouches that cartographers reveal the objectives and prejudices that inform their maps. So not all cartouches have elaborate symbolism, but the ones that do, that symbolism often speaks to the cartographer's interests in a way that makes them absolutely fundamental for interpreting maps. I also found that there was not really a satisfactory definition of cartouches, so I developed my own. I define a cartouche as a framed device containing text or decorative elements together with associated adjacent decorative elements. So it's curious that while the frame is an essential defining characteristic of a cartouche, at the same time, some of what appears outside the frame is part of a cartouche. The frame can be composed of various objects. So in this case, we have the title information in the center, and the frame around the title information is composed of a landscape at the bottom, and these two trees that grow up on the left and right and lean together. And one might say that in this case, the frame is not quite complete because the two trees do not touch. But it's worth mentioning that in hand-colored copies of this map, you have the clouds in between the two trees. And when the clouds are colored, the frame feels a bit more complete. So as I said, elements that are associated with the frame but outside it need to be considered as part of the cartouche. So here we have this very clear frame around the title information on the map. And then we have the mountain above, and we certainly have to consider the mountain as part of the cartouche because the mountain is what's creating the frame, basically. We have these Native Americans to the left and right. We have this whole landscape at the bottom. All of that is part of the cartouche. And it happens that sometimes the collection of figures outside the frame can be much larger than the frame itself. So in this case, we have the title of the map, Africa, which is framed. And we have this enormous collection of people and animals outside the frame, but they are all part of the cartouche. I'll say a few words about the early history of cartouches. So here we have a nautical chart by Giovanni da Carignano. This is, the image is in black and white because the chart no longer exists. It was destroyed by fire. Just to orient ourselves, here we have the Iberian Peninsula. We can see the boot of Italy. And if we zoom in on Northern Africa, we can see that we have several texts, framed text in Northern Africa. So these all qualify as cartouches. These are the most basic cartouches possible. There's no symbolic decoration. There are no allegorical figures. These are cartouches, and these are some of the earliest I'm aware of. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most elaborately decorated maps to survive from the Middle Ages. Just to orient ourselves a little bit, I've indicated the Iberian Peninsula, the Red Sea, which is helpfully indicated in red, and Taprobana in the Indian Ocean, which is usually identified with Sri Lanka. If we zoom in on that part of the map, we again have these three framed texts, three framed descriptive texts. And again, these are the very simplest frames that one could possibly imagine, but these are cartouches. Looking at Fra Mauro's famous Mappamundi from the middle of the 15th century, we'll zoom in on the Atlantic. And here we have the beginning of some decoration in cartouches. So the cartouches are presented as scrolls, as if these are independent pieces of paper that were set onto the map. So at least a little decoration appearing in cartouches in the 15th century. Looking at a few cartouche firsts, we have Johannes Ruysch's world map of 1507, which has a substantial program of cartouches. We'll focus on these two, which are on the west coasts of the New World. And if we zoom in, what the cartographer has done here is locate these cartouches as a way of avoiding having to try to draw an unknown coast. And we'll see other examples of this where cartouches are placed as a way of hiding geographical ignorance, as a way of that the cartographer chooses to avoid committing to one side of a question to whose answer he does not know. This is Martin Waldseemüller's Carta Marina of 1516, printed on 12 sheets. It's a printed map, but it only survives in one exemplar, which is in the Kislat collection at the Library of Congress. It also has a very extensive program of cartouches of descriptive texts, the vast majority of which are undecorated. They're simple rectangular frames. But there are two of them that have more elaborately decorated frames, and these are among the earliest elaborately decorated cartouches that appear on a map. If we zoom in on them, we can see that the smaller of the two has what's called rope work decoration and then also vegetal motifs. And the larger one has rope work decoration, vegetal motifs, and also two dragons at the top. And it's very interesting which two cartouches Waldseemüller chose for this more elaborate decoration. It's precisely the two cartouches that offer metadata about the map. The smaller one, declares his official privilege to print the map. And the larger one has text in which he explains how and why he went about making this map. And cartouches are often places for a sort of privileged communication between the cartographer and the audience, where the symbolism of the cartouche can reveal things about the cartographer's interests. And I find it impressive that the two cartouches that contain metadata about the map are the two that he chose for this more elaborate decoration. There's an additional interesting aspect to the large cartouche in which he talks about his reasons for making the map. He uses it to avoid committing to whether it's possible to sail around South America, whether it's possible to sail around South America and head towards Asia. So if we zoom in a bit, there's a clear southern limit of knowledge. We have the coastline with place names, and then that suddenly ends. And if we asked ourselves, what would happen if we tried to sail south of that southern limit of knowledge? Well, we would bump into this cartouche, in effect. Here we have one of the earliest cartouche illustrations that tells a story, and it's the story of the Last Judgment. This is on Scruton's map from 1572. And we have a clear frame, and then sort of flowing out from this frame, we have this very elaborate depiction of the Last Judgment. So another stage in the evolution of cartouches to the inclusion of a whole narrative. And in the 17th century, cartographers began illustrating cartouches with local peoples, animals, plants, and products. And this is an important stage in terms of being able to interpret cartouches, because in depicting local peoples, animals, and products, the cartographer often reveals something of his or her interests in the region, or the interests of the person commissioning the map. So here we have Willem Blau's map of the West Indies, first printed in 1630. This copy that we see here printed in 1660. And if we zoom in on South America, we see this cartouche decorated with peoples of South America. And he does something very similar in Africa, where we see native peoples of Africa, and then also the man on the left is holding an enormous piece of ivory, so one of the products of particular interest to Europeans. And in the late 17th and 18th centuries, cartouches achieved a spectacular degree of artistic elaboration. At least they did in some quarters. Of course, artists have different tastes, different preferences. Some artists preferred less elaborate cartouches, but some cartographers and the artists they hired were making really spectacular cartouches. So here we have Johann Homann's map of the Christmas flood of 1717. So here is the, one of the cartouches on the map. We can see it occupies a very large percentage of the surface of the map. So zooming in a bit, we have this inset map, which shows the area flooded. And then just to the right, we have this amazing image that shows the violence of this flood. So zooming in the upper left, we have an image of the goddess of that day, the goddess of December 25th, 1717, threatening havoc, holding this arrow. We have the god of the winds blowing to cause the winds, rain, snow, and lightning. And then in addition to the god of the winds himself, we have an additional wind head depicted below, showing that the winds were not blowing in just one direction. Then we have Neptune and his aquatic steeds raising the floodwaters. So his aquatic steeds are spewing water, increasing the volume of water. We have two weeping putti who hold a banner with a quote from Ovid that says, "Albeit the god of the sea has overwhelmed so many in the cruel waves, how small the number deserving to be drowned." So a quote alluding to the violence of storms. And then we have an image of flooded buildings and people in distress. So it's a spectacular creation, a composite of all these different elements working towards giving us an idea of the violence of this storm. So we'll move on now after that introduction to our main subject, colonialist imagery in cartouches. And we'll begin with an example from Arnold Floris van Langren. This is a spectacular cartouche on a globe that was made around 1630 to 1632. So above, in the middle, we have a personification of Europe, receiving gifts from various peoples. So what's depicted here is not trade. It's all these other peoples happily giving their goods to Europe, who sits at the center, which is this European colonialist fantasy that all these other peoples in the world wanted to just give their products to Europe. And just to identify a few of the peoples depicted here, here we have the Chinese, the Persians, the Asians, and the Mexicans. So it's really quite a broad spectrum of peoples who are all giving their goods to Europe. Then we have this large text about the sources of various exotic goods, including precious stones and spices. So the text is describing the sources of some of the goods that are being given to Europe above. And then to the left and the right and below, we have depictions of exotic plants, including spices. So we have depictions of these exotic plants, exotic and valuable, I should specify, text about these goods, and then a depiction of them all being given to this personification of Europe above. Here we have Arazi's map of Brazil from 1698, which is oriented with the north to the right, so west at the top. And if we look at the cartouche in the lower right, we have a long text about the size of Brazil, its discovery by Portugal, and the taking of the land from the hands of the barbarians. So this is clearly a colonialist narrative. And the text goes on to say that then it was invaded by the Dutch, and after a long war, retaken by the Portuguese in 1654. And then in Brazil, we have this scene that we'll zoom in on of the cannibalistic dismemberment and cooking of peoples. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then in the lower right, we have another cartouche. If we zoom in on that, above we have Portugal's coat of arms. And so we're to understand that everything beneath that sort of flows from Portugal. And the puto, the little boy, holds a cross and a banner that reads "Subjugit gentes" in Latin, that is to say, it conquers peoples, referring to Portugal. And then he also holds chains and metal restraints on an indigenous woman below. And then having a look at the right-hand side, so the puto holds a sword, which in this case, the colorist has mistakenly painted green, so it's difficult to see. And then we have another banner, which says "Vicit Heresies," it conquers heresies, again referring to Portugal. And then we have this personification of heresies below with its serpent tails, indicating the monstrous nature of heresy. And so near this cartouche, we have this scene of cannibalism, and the proximity of that scene to this cartouche is no accident, because laws in both Spain and Portugal made it legal for their citizens in the New World to enslave or make war against cannibals. It was thought that cannibalism was such a heinous crime that almost any action taken against cannibals was justified. So this cartouche implies that two aspects of colonial subjugation, the military and evangelistic, are inseparable. They're depicted together. They're both flowing from the Portuguese coat of arms above. We have Heinrich Scherer's map of North America from 1702. We'll zoom in on the lower right. So we have three maps that show the territorial claims of the French, Spanish, and English in North America. So first, there's a map that shows the French claims, which is basically Louisiana and the Great Lakes. And the map has a title, and it says, "Through the hopes of the French." So indicating that the French grasp on these territories is not that firm. They hold these by hopes more than by actions. Then we have a map of the Spanish claims, which is basically New Mexico and California. And the title is "Through the care of the Spanish," so indicating a somewhat more firm engagement, if you will, on the part of the Spanish. And then we have the English claims, basically the eastern seaboard of North America. And the title of the map is Through the Diligence of the English. So Scherer, the cartographer, is indicating his opinion about the relative strength, firmness of the holdings in North America of these three colonial powers. That's reflected in another way. We zoom in a little bit. So the titles of the French and Spanish maps are peeling off, but that's not the case with the English map. So Scherer is, in a very creative way, again indicating that, in his opinion, the French and Spanish holdings in North America are not that secure. And then to the left and right, we have Huron and Iroquois Indians in subservient positions, seeming to accept European control of their lands. So this map is really amazing in its consciousness of maps of cartography as a tool for making colonial claims, making claims about land possession. We have Adrian Rayland's two-sheet map of Java from about 1718. There we have Batavia, the capital of the Dutch East Indies. We'll zoom in on the Cartouche in the lower left. So below we have an inset map of Batavia, showing the Dutch capital in more detail. And then above, we have the Dutch lion, or as it's called below, the Belgian lion, and the coat of arms of Batavia, and then a native Javanese man giving trade goods to the Dutch lion. So again, it's not trade that's depicted. The native peoples are just giving their goods to this personification. And then we have two Javanese men tied up as prisoners. And then we have this text below, which says, "Here sits the Belgian lion, ruling over the subjugated Indians. Here he shakes his mane and moves his golden neck. When he roars, stunned kings laid down their crowns, and the East itself abandons its treasures. The Ganges was the furthest limit or hope of the ancients, but the Dutch have left it far behind them," meaning the Dutch have far surpassed it. So we can see there's a very clear emphasis in these lines on subjugation and treasures. So I mentioned earlier that Matthias Suter is one of my favorite cartographers in terms of his Cartouche decorations. So we'll have a closer look at one of his maps here. So we'll look first at the Cartouche in the lower left. So we have an Indian bringing Brazil wood to the scene, together with a crate of tobacco. In the lower right, we have an Indian woman making the alcoholic drink kaumin from manioc. We have a chief with his attendant. And then in the lower right, we have Indians harvesting sugarcane and tobacco. So a peaceful image of native peoples producing lots of goods that Europeans would be interested in. And in the upper left, we have this text about the discovery of the New World. It says, "The New World in the year 1492, Christopher Columbus first detected the Antilles, not according to the plan of creation, but rather in the name of discovery. Amerigo Vespucci of Florence followed in his footsteps in the year 1497 and went into the interior of the continent and brought back immortal glory, so much so that the land was called America in his name, even though it is commonly called the West Indies. The kings of Spain have huge dominions there, but there are also many colonies and trading posts of the English, the French, the Portuguese, and the Dutch. The light of the Christian faith shines forth because of the missionaries, but in many regions, the thick shadows of idolatrous worship still darken minds." So a considerable emphasis not only on the discovery, but also on the colonial possessions in the New World. And then zooming back out, above we have a personification of religion with a banner that reads, "In the West a light, in the West has risen." The syntax is very strange, but referring to the arrival of Christianity in the New World. And then at the left, we have three explorers sitting at a table, perhaps representing Columbus, Hernan Cortez, and Henry Hudson. On the table, we have perhaps Columbus holding an egg, perhaps alluding to the Earth's sphericity. And above this banner that says, "It is easy to add to our discoveries." So European powers already have substantial holdings in North America and South America, but this indicates this desire in conquering even more. And then on the right, we have two native men offering riches before a simple altar with a crucifix. And above the banner that reads, "It breathes forth eternal riches," but it's not clear whether that refers to the New World breathing forth riches or the crucifix breathing forth riches, or perhaps both. Thus, religion oversees both greedy explorers and evangelization, which is quite interesting. And we have the cartouche below, which shows the opportunity represented by the New World in the form of peaceful peoples who are producing goods of interest to Europeans. And then above, the cartouche showing the process of exploitation and evangelization as being underway. We'll look at another map by the same cartographer, Matthias Suter, his map of Southeast Asia from about 1730. It has an elaborate cartouche in the lower left. So in the left-hand part of that cartouche, we have a scene of evangelization with a white man preaching to Muslims who are portrayed as eager listeners. The man points up to a sun that symbolizes the Trinity. And we have these two angels bringing a Bible, a chalice, and a pitcher. And then scrolling right a bit, just beneath the title information, we have several pieces of porcelain, which were one of the Asian products of the greatest interest to Europeans. And then scrolling a bit further to the right, we have a personification of Europe, who is receiving, again as gifts, not by trade, many goods from native peoples. And then Neptune indicating the ships in the background that will take these goods to Europe. So it seems that Suter tended to pair scenes of evangelization and scenes of economic exploitation in his cartouches relating to lands outside of Europe. Here we have Paul Revere's map view of part of the town of Boston in New England, and British ships of war landing their troops, exclamation point, 1768. And here we have the British troops, which are landing and mustering on Long Wharf to suppress the rebellious city of Boston. And in the lower right, we have a cartouche. So Revere's dedication is to the British commander, and the text is just dripping with sarcasm. He writes, "To the Earl of Hillsborough, His Majesty's Secretary of State for America, this view of the only well-planned expedition formed for supporting the dignity of Britain and chastising the insolence of America is humbly inscribed." And zooming in, we have a Native American woman representing the American colonists holding a bow and arrow, and she has her foot on the chest of a British soldier, and the soldier's musket and hat indicate that he's a grenadier of the 29th Regiment of Foot, which is precisely the regiment that was occupying Boston. So there's a very curious play of colonial hierarchy in this image. The colonists who are being oppressed by Britain have adopted as their symbol indigenous people whom they themselves were treating as colonial subjects. So this is a puzzling image, but certainly part of what's being conveyed here is that even an Indian woman could conquer these British soldiers who've come to suppress the city. James Rennell's map of Hindustan, India from 1782. This is a very influential map in terms of its geography. Rennell had entered the service of the East India Company in 1763, so well before he made this map. And zooming in on the cartouche, we see it here. So Rennell published a pamphlet to accompany this map. We see the title page of that here. And we have a very unusual case in which the cartographer offers an explanation for his own cartouche. So he offers that explanation in this pamphlet. He writes, explanation of the emblematical frontispiece of the map, and frontispiece is an interesting name for a cartouche. He says, Britannia receiving into her protection the sacred books of the Hindus presented by the pundits or learned Brahmins in allusion to the humane interposition of the British legislature in favor of the natives of Bengal in the year 1781. Britannia is supported by a pedestal on which are engraven the victories by means of which the British nation obtained and has hitherto upheld its influence in India, amongst which the two recent ones of Porto Novo and Sholingar, gained by General Coote, are particularly pointed out by a sepoy and his comrade. So again, an unusual case in which a cartographer explains his own cartouche, offers an interpretation. But there's more to say about this cartouche than appears in his explanation. Just to, yeah, I meant to show these a moment ago. Here we see the Indian gentleman handing their sacred books to this personification of Britain, and then the two Indian men looking at this monument that lists the English victories, but we'll zoom in a bit. So above, at the top of the cartouche, we have a sword and a caduceus, the image of medicine, so indicating Britain's military and humanitarian intentions towards India. Then zooming in, we have atop this monument, the British lion with its paw on a sphere that represents the world. And then the personification of Britain. She has her spear at the ready, but has set her shield aside, at least for the moment. So she's ready to leap back into military action if necessary. Then at the bottom, we have the spear resting on a bolt of cotton, so one of the important products of India for Britain. And then we have some devices of British cultural production, so dividers, painter's palette, and a stonemason's tools, so indicating some of their building and artistic products in India. And then, as Rennell himself said, we have the Brahmins handing their sacred books to Britannia, so giving their culture, basically, to this personification of Britain. And then the two Indian men reviewing the list of British military victories in India inscribed in this monument. And of course, that's an incredibly colonialist image, this list of here's all the places we have conquered you. And then moving across to the other side of the cartouche, we have the loading of a British East Indiaman with goods for the journey back to England. So of course, an emphasis on trade that motivated the British colonial enterprise. I'm just zooming back out to see the whole cartouche. And we'll end with this map. So in 1802, while the Louisiana territory was still under French control, Thomas Jefferson had written, "There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans, through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market, and from its fertility, it will ere long yield more than half of our whole produce and contain more than half our inhabitants." In 1803, Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase from France and was interested in obtaining good maps of this new territory. So John Boquete de Oisserie made in 1804 this plan of New Orleans and its environs, and the cartographer claimed to have dedicated the map to Jefferson, but no such statement appears on the map itself. And just looking briefly at the different parts of the map, here we have an inset of the Louisiana Territory, so showing the geographical context of the city. An inset map of the region right around New Orleans. A view of the city's central square. The key to the places within the city, which are indicated by letters. The city itself. And then this cartouche, which we zoom in on, and we see we have the Mississippi flowing to the Gulf of Mexico. We have an eagle holding the American flag in its beak and shining light down on a Native American man. And the Native American man receives that light with a welcoming gesture. The message is clear. The cartographer and implicitly his intended audience believed that the indigenous inhabitants of the lands of the Louisiana Purchase should and would enthusiastically welcome the beneficent control of the United States. We know that President Jefferson owned a copy of this map, even if it wasn't actually dedicated to him. The Secretary of State, John Adams, received another, and another hung in the Senate chamber in Washington, D.C. So this imagery was familiar to US leaders. So a few conclusions. It is in cartouches that the cartographer reveals the aims and prejudices that inform the map. Colonialist cartouches on European maps usually speak to both economic and spiritual conquest. And this European fantasy of native passivity and generosity underlies many of these images. And I'll also emphasize that Scherer's cartouche shows an early awareness of the role that maps play in claiming territory and as propagandistic tools of conquest. So as I said, I've written a book about cartouches published by Brill. It's available in both electronic format and a hardback edition. And thanks to the support of Citco and the Kislak Family Foundation, it's available in open access, which means you can download the whole book for free. Here is the link to do that. So if you want to take a photograph of this, you can easily download the whole book. I've also put cards at the table in the back of the room that have a QR code on them. So feel free to pick one of those up and pass it along to friends. It's really a fun subject. I know the colonial material gets a little grim after a while, but in the book I explore many other aspects of cartouches, and one of the things I found in my research is that basically any subject can be addressed in a cartouche. So it's really an engaging variety. Thank you very much.
Chet always manages a superb presentation with exactly the right amount of time for questions and so forth. But I am just blown away by this presentation. It's so extraordinary. Not only the images you've shown us, but your ability to help us understand what is being conveyed. I studied these cartouches, and I never quite get the symbolism that you've derived. It's really wonderful. So we do have time for questions. And I'm so glad we brought you out, Chet. This is such a wonderful presentation. Come on back to the mic.
Yes.
Are any of these textual cartouches typeset?
Yes. The question is any of these textual cartouches, the cartouches that have text in them, are they typeset? That's a good question. Examples are not coming immediately to mind. There must be some, but I'm not. So yes, I don't know of any. There are certainly cases where in woodcut maps, type was inserted through the wood to print place names, but I'm not thinking of cases where the cartouche text is typeset, but I'll think about that. Yes.
The next to the last one showed India. It didn't point it out, but it looked like on top of the cartouche on the top.
Yep.
Those are opium copies.
That may well be, yes.
Yeah.
Likely so.
That was the big thing that England did was grow opium and import it to China.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes, Wes.
Early in your presentation, the 1516 Carta Marina by Portsmouth had all these text boxes, what I call text boxes. You were calling them cartouches. I think of the cartouches as having decorative title plates, but in that case, you were calling all of those text box cartouches. Help us understand the use of that term.
Yeah, to use the term consistently, I don't see how to avoid this. The frame is if something's not framed, I don't see how it can be called a cartouche. And so the cartouche is the frame is an essential aspect of cartouches. And once you acknowledge that, I don't know how to draw a line. So do you only accept the things that are decorated as a cartouche? And then what degree of decoration would that be? But there's an interesting philosophic aspect of cartouches, which is they have an anti-cartographic element to them. They occupy space on the map. Whatever would be beneath that is obscured. So to some extent, for any map that has a cartouche, you basically need a second map to show what is hidden by the cartouches. And that characteristic is shared by even the most basic cartouches like these. Yes.
Are the two, what I would call cartouches in the bottom left without any text, are those cartouches? I mean, they were obviously intended to put a dedication.
Exactly.
Or something, so are they cartouches even though they don't have the text?
I would say so.
I would.
Yeah. But that is an interesting question. Yeah.
That were the labels that being peeled off in Spain. What year was that map?
1702. Well, why do you ask? There we go. Yes. Yes, so the question is, who were the consumers of these maps and who, well, maybe there's two questions. Who were the consumers of the maps, who were buying them, and then who would read the cartouches? Yes, the consumers of maps were certainly people engaged in trade and people engaged in the military. Those were two important groups of consumers, but there was also a market for an intellectual market, scholars and people interested in geography of the world or in a specific region would certainly be buying these maps. One thing I would very much like to find, and I have looked very hard for and have not found, is a, let's say, late 17th or early 18th century account of someone interpreting a cartouche, explaining their understanding of it. I have not found that. It would be very interesting to read something like that. But there are cases, there's another map by Suter, which is a map of Canada, and in the cartouche, in the title cartouche, there's an image of a cartographer. He's making a map of Canada, so it's some sort of self-portrait by the cartographer. It's a cartographer making a map of Canada on a map of Canada, and in his other hand, he's holding the scales of justice. And then down below are the coats of arms of England and France. And the map is from, I think, about 1750. And at this time, France and England were competing for territory in Canada. And so he's making a map of Canada. He's holding the scales of justice. We have the coats of arms of England and France below. The message is he's trying to make a map that balances their territorial interests equitably. But it's interesting that there's not a word about that in the title of the map. The only way you understand that that's his intention is by interpreting the cartouche. And that and other pieces of evidence incline me to think that an ability to interpret these types of images was expected more than we have these days. And to be very candid, this project is as much history of art as it is history of cartography. But I think it's, yes. I was going to say that in really interpreting the cartouches is an essential part of interpreting a map, if they're of any artistic elaboration whatsoever.
I believe that in most cases, the artist of the cartouche was not the cartographer. And some of them were some, and most are not. What do you feel was the general relationship between the cartographer and the artist? Was there a third person, maybe the publisher, who told the artist, okay, I want you to show this or emphasize that, or is it the cartographer who's doing that? I mean, do you have any sense of the relationship between the person who did the cartouche and the map maker?
So first, let me say that's absolutely right, that usually it was not the cartographer who was making the cartouches. In some cases, we are able to see that it was. So in Urbano Monte's spectacular manuscript world map in the Rumsey Center at Stanford, Urbano Monte was not a very good artist, and he admits that, and you can see that the cartouche design on the map is very poorly executed. So in that case, we know that he made it. But again, in the vast majority of cases, it was not the cartographer designing the cartouches, it was a hired artist. Unfortunately, as you said, in many cases, they are not signed, so we don't know who made them. And to my knowledge, we don't have information about that interaction. We don't have letters in which the cartographer or the person commissioning the map is explaining what they want in a cartouche. We have some letters, I think, from Joan Blau talking about the decoration of cartouches, but in a very generic way, not specifying a certain political orientation or economic orientation that the cartouche should have.
Question from the Zoom.
Yes.
What was the most shocking cartouche that you had found?
the question is, what is the most shocking cartouche I found? One towards the end of the book is a map of part of Brazil. And it's a very simple scene. It has the title information above, 2 trees, and on the left, there's an indigenous man with a bow and arrow pointing across to the other tree where there's a European man making a map. So probably a self-portrait by the cartographer. So an indigenous man pointing his arrow at the European map maker. And I think this summarizes in an amazingly concise way the experience of people all over the world who have had European map makers come to visit them, and their experience is that trouble follows. So that inherent tension is conveyed by this, again, it's not one of these very elaborate images like this one. It's a very simple image, but it conveys that message very powerfully. And so it's maybe not the most shocking cartouche I've encountered, but definitely one of the most striking.
What do you know about Holy Land cartouches?
Holy Land cartouches. Well, cartouches are an endlessly rich subject. And I wrote one book. I feel like I could probably write 2 more without much difficulty. And one idea for another book that I have in mind is to choose, say, a dozen different regions of the world and see how the symbolism in their cartouches has changed over time and how that reflects perceptions of those regions. And some regions lend themselves to more elaborate cartouches more readily than others. And the Holy Land is one of those regions. So the coast sort of goes like this, and there's a lot of space in the Mediterranean for a cartouche, and lots of cartographers took advantage of that with very elaborate cartouches on maps of the Holy Land. And so in thinking about such a book, I thought that that would be a good candidate to include maps of the Holy Land to see how their cartouches, the symbolism in their cartouches changed over time and how that reflected changing perceptions of the land. And yeah, I've collected a fair bit of information, examples of that, and that could easily be a talk right there. So it's a good subject. Yes. There are things on Chinese maps, framed texts on Chinese maps, which one would have to call a cartouche, cartouches, but they don't serve the same functions. They don't have the same symbolism. There's one Chinese world map in 2 hemispheres that was made with a lot of European influence, that has things that are much more like European cartouches. And I have it in mind to write about those, but I haven't managed that yet. But that example stands out as it's on the one hand, it's an example of a Chinese map that has something like symbolically rich cartouches, but on the other hand, it was made with a lot of European influence. So, yes.
Are there any modern maps that use cartouches, or what is like a current use?
So cartouches, elaborate cartouches petered out in the late 18th and early 19th century. But then they had a revival in pictorial maps, 20th century and 21st century pictorial maps. And I think it's fair to say I don't find as many examples of cartouches and pictorial maps that have quite the symbolic elaboration of the examples from the 17th and 18th centuries, but it remains something to be investigated further.
This one question from online from one of your early maps, and you said the French had settlement once all up the Mississippi and then the Great Lakes, the other Illinois River. Was this more political spin?
Yes.
Repeat.
Yes. It's the. I'm trying to figure out which map. I think. Yeah, I think it's this one. Yeah. So the question is the representation of French holdings sort of fair, or is there a political spin indicated there? And I mean, quite possibly, but it's also worth remarking that that's a pretty small map, and trying to make an accurate depiction of anyone's holdings in a map that small is not easy.
We'll call it at this point. I know Chet will hang around. You will hang around and answer questions. We are so grateful. Thank you for your warm applause. For those who are not in the virtual land, we just had a wonderful round of applause for our speaker. Good night.